Hello, everyone, and welcome again to your weekly episode of the Japan Club official podcast. I am one of your hosts, Yuki.
I'm Ernesto.
I'm Jerry.
I'm Russ.
All right, so today is going to be one of our contemporary Japanese society episodes, and this week's topic is going to be about work life in Japan, just the daily grind that everyone who's out of college and sometimes who are in college have to deal with while in living in Japanese society. So, just a brief overview we can start off with in terms of what that entails. Just like the average, there's this image we have of the Japanese salaryman. And anyone here want to give us a brief overview of just sort of what that kind of life would be like?
Yeah, so just based on kind of its portrayal in popular culture, and obviously it does have some basis in real life, but the kind of image of the Japanese salaryman is one of this kind of really hardworking young man who kind of goes overboard with his duties, and he's kind of grinding every day nonstop, and he's being kind of overworked by his superiors, etc. So it's not a very kind of gleaming image of of a salaryman, but it's. I think it tells you a lot about what the kind of Japanese culture around business is like. So it's an interesting one to look at.
Yeah, there's a lot of numbers you can stick to these kind of images as well. It's like you think of them waking up really early, maybe arriving at work. I mean, 8 a.m. for an adult, probably not too early, but still pretty early for college students everywhere, I'm pretty sure. But yeah, you can usually expect to arrive at work around 8 or 9 a.m. and you work late into the evening, maybe up to like 8, 9 p.m. So it's a really long work day you can expect if you're just like this is an average, obviously. It doesn't apply by industry, and we can talk more about the specifics of that in a bit. But yeah, and then after you've worked until it's late into the night, you go out with your coworkers and just drink and unwind for the day. And that's or sometimes if you don't have a lot of friends, you go to karaoke by yourself. That's also
Or you just go to the bar by yourself.
Or go to the bar by
I've
yourself.
definitely seen some salary men at bars by themselves. And
Yeah.
there's there.
Oh,
So yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, there's just a set of activities that cater towards the working average person, and sort of karaoke bars and all these kinds of places. These things are not always meant for the tourists and stuff. They're meant for just people who are getting out of their workday.
Yeah, and one thing that you kind of talked about earlier, but I don't think you stuck a name to it. Sometimes these people they're working overtime, like they're working a lot more than they should, or at least more than is kind of, I guess, required of them, and it's called zangyo, or like overtime, and something that I found really interesting. I learned about this after watching, coincidentally, another podcast, is that there's something called nokori zangyo, which is like you only stay behind because either your coworkers or your superior hasn't left, and you don't want to look bad by leaving. So you just stay behind and you do like work even though you don't have to, or like it's ridiculous.
It's considered rude or lazy if you leave before your superiors or your direct equals do. And that becomes a game of chicken where people just don't leave. When you think about it from that perspective, it's kind of absurd, but trust me, it makes a lot of sense in terms of the sort of social aspect of it all.
We talked about that dimension in a previous episode pertaining to, I think it might have been in the language episode as well, where we kind of hinted at it, but the relationship between an individual and their social superior is very important, and that carries into the workplace as well. So even at for like more casual things, I don't know how frequent this occurs, but there are oftentimes work parties that companies will hold. And one, it's considered hilariously rude to decline an invitation unless you literally have no physical way of being there. And also when you're there, there's a lot of social management that goes on.
Yeah.
So like for instance, if it's a drinking party, everyone takes a drink whenever the most superior person in the room takes a drink, but no one takes a drink until that person takes their first drink.
So it's like a birthday cake.
Literally, it's like that when that person drinks, everybody drinks. And when that person takes their first drink, then everyone else is allowed to drink at their leisure.
Oh, I never knew that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I don't know how commonly this is practiced, but I've heard that it's frequent enough for it to be like noticed or like notable. There are probably some deviations.
There's a lot of interesting kind of customs around those nomikai or like drinking parties. Like I don't remember if this is exactly right, but if you're socially inferior, you're not supposed to kind of grab the drink and like serve yourself. You're supposed to wait for like somebody, is it lower than you to pour it for you? Or
it might be lower because higher wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, you're right. So
but actually no, higher could make sense, and you're supposed to like be grateful or something.
I gotta look. I gotta
it's
look.
It's one or the other, but they both make sense. I'm not gonna front.
It's just kind of weird. Like you have to kind of navigate through this kind of cultural minefield of little customs at the drinking party. It's really interesting.
If you haven't noticed, drinking is very important in Japan.
Yeah.
Like not even trying to be sarcastic. Like it's actually just a thing people do. And it's kind of considered very socially acceptable. Like it doesn't have the same stigma that I would say it has in the West. So I would definitely say that once you enter the workplace in America, going out to drink with your coworkers is pretty common. But I would say it's a lot more expected and like common in Japan. Like I feel like it's not something you could do every day after work if you're in America, but in Japan, I feel like there's like an uptick in frequency, like what's considered acceptable. Again, that's just my impression from what I've heard and from what I've seen, but
yeah, well, the article I'm reading doesn't specify whether it has to be your social superior or inferior. It just says that like you should never serve yourself and you have to wait for people.
Yeah, no, it's a minefield you have to navigate almost, and it can be like I would never survive it because I genuinely am completely oblivious to that kind of signaling. So I'd show up in the bar, I'd sit down, I just grab a drink, pour it, and then I'd be I would not survive.
Yeah. No, like the other thing that I think is worth discussing is the kind of ridiculous amount of hours that people work sometimes. I remember watching a documentary on a problem that Japan was having with people dying from overwork, and it talked about people who were working sometimes like 18 to like 20 hours a day. I'm reading an article here about an anonymous worker who works at IBM Japan, and she claims that she was working 18 to 20 hours, and this is a woman who was doing it. So
Side note,
my dad is a huge workaholic, so he works so much.
Side note, you'd be fine because you don't drink anyway.
You'd be grab fine. The nearest thing of apple juice.
But on the note of what Ernesto was talking about, so it does vary by corporation. Obviously, that's how the company treats their workers is obviously going to be different from company to company. But there's actually something that's referred. I don't remember if it's kurosha. Whatever the word is for black companies. But do you remember what the word is? Basically, there's a word that is used to refer to companies that, for lack of a better phrasing, treat their employees like garbage and overwork them excessively. So much so that it's actually covered in university courses. I was taking a course on surveying Japanese youth.
This is called buraku kigyo. So
buraku kigyo.
I heard another one I heard one that used kuro that had the kanji for black. But I was taking a course on surveying like like the social environment for younger Japanese students, young men and women, while I was studying abroad, and there was a section that we were covering about like whether or not students would be willing to work at one of these companies, because we're talking about like what life goals and interests youth have.
Mhm.
And of course that came into the conversation, and I found it very interesting that it was actually seriously talked about from like a legitimate perspective. Like it wasn't like, oh, don't work for that company, they treat everyone like garbage. But it was less of that and more of like, well, is working for a company like that worth it? Like
Yeah.
it was like a social expectation that companies like that exist, and you just have to deal with it. If that's a step you have to take to get further in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are some students who are like, oh, I work abroad, or oh, I work in Japan. But for the ones who are working abroad, they're like, oh, I don't want to work for a black company, so I'll go abroad because that's the only option in my industry. So like there are a lot of implications with those companies existing.
Like it's interesting you bring that up, because that does sort of go into sort of our sort of next topic, which is about differences between industries and sort of how certain industries have reputations of being, you know, more likely to have black companies than other industries. And so I mean the general trend, and this probably holds true for a lot of first world countries, is the more white collar you get, the higher the risk of these kinds of predatory practices and these customs being more important.
Yeah.
So yeah, you have people in Japanese population who just kind of like, you know, they work as like fishermen, or they work as like construction workers who, you know, because while Japan does have a lot of construction workers who are foreign expats, they also have quite a few that are just Japanese workers.
Mm-hmm.
And like in those cases, there is still those customs, but they're not near. It's much more it's less formalized and less kind of institutionalized. But then as you work your way into more and more white collar jobs, office jobs, and that kind of thing, that's where these customs really begin to be the bread and butter of social interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And so
I'm looking. No, sorry. Go ahead.
oh no, I was going to say it's important to also consider how the industries can be separated based on gender as well.
Yeah, that's huge.
Because you know, service industry is dominated by women who work it. People who work as receptionists, people who work as clerks to, you know, stores, waitresses, all that stuff. And insofar as I can tell, it's difficult to pin down an exact reason for why, but it's something to do with some unspoken social custom.
For women to be like the entry point for anyone like trying to get into, for trying to do with like the clerical aspects of a company. Is that what you're talking about?
Sort of. I think it's mostly it's some fusion of just outdated concepts of what of the societal role that women may be expected to have in the workforce, and just I think that's because there are still women working in other like in the office office positions as well. But what's almost jarring is just what percentage of the service industry and the sort of those entry level positions and such are filled by women.
Interesting.
Yeah, I guess like that I have to imagine that's kind of deeply rooted in a kind of traditionalist culture, and it just hasn't changed as much as maybe the West has in terms of, you know, how jobs are distributed amongst, you know, the sexes. But I don't know, what do you guys think?
Like I definitely think that like, well, more women work per capita in Japan than in the United States. So there's a higher level of employment. It's just that like the distribution of what kind of employment each gender gets is a bit skewed. And it may have to do with just outdated ideas of you know, women in the workplace. I think, and it, you know, companies may be more likely to favor just the promotion of men over women for reasons that probably aren't based in scientific fact or logic.
Yeah.
But it's difficult to say. I don't have too much experience at the workplace, so this isn't something that has a sort of obvious cultural answer that I can come up with.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, and one thing that I also think is really interesting is the way that the Japanese language factors into your interactions at
Mm.
the workplace. Like everybody, or at least I think everybody watching this podcast has heard about keigo, which is like really polite Japanese language, and then just normal casual speech. But there's like different levels of keigo that you would use to address like different social superiors, and I don't know, I think it's just really fascinating to see like how the words keep changing like according to who you're talking to.
Yeah.
And it gets more and more complicated and more kind of like I'm low, you're high.
As-
But yeah.
As someone who's probably gonna have to deal with this because I'm in business and Japanese as my majors, Keigo is so important that it's oftentimes referred to as business Japanese.
Yeah.
Just because like there's actually like a part of Keigo that is so commonly used in business transactions, informal business transactions, that it's just colloquially referred to as business Japanese when it's taught. So what you'll see even in like upper level conversations, like between CFOs and between the C-suites and all that stuff, and between lead marketing team members and other companies and whatnot, when they're dealing with other companies, they both, there's no like implied superior. So in the context, they're socially equal, let's say. Both companies are still using like very submissive, is not the right word, but like subservient, I suppose, levels of Keigo, where it's like very like placing yourself beneath the party you're speaking to. So even though they're both at the same level, both of them are deliberately choosing and expected to use language placing the other above them, so to speak. And like this emphasis on formality is, like there's a lot of stuff that goes into that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I remembered when we brought this up, this chapter from Nakama 1, the first year textbook. There's a Japanese culture section like in chapter 2, and it talks about business cards and how
the way you're supposed to hand them.
Yeah, no, and then like it tells you a sentence that people use to like apologize for not having business cards.
Business cards are really important in Japan, like insanely important. If you don't have a business card, you're doing something wrong.
No, and so this is what the sentence says when a person is expected to have a card and does not have one, usually apologizes for his or her oversight by saying, あいにく名刺を切らせてしまい申し訳ありません. So it's like super polite, like super like, oh, I'm so sorry, because like
even the way you apologize is in like the end of that sentence, 申し訳ありません, is basically there is absolutely no reason for me to have done this. Like that's the closest thing to a literal translation.
It's my dad has a ton of business cards lying around the apartment, so I understand that sentiment. But, it's important also to this is a good transition, I think, into talking about how there's a difference in sort of inherent rich versus poor gap that you might expect in something like in American society. To the point where like in American society, like you have your average workers, they sort of work their 9 to 5. And then there's like the CEOs and the members of the board who are board of directors who are just like really, really wealthy people who almost seem to live a completely different life than that of the average office worker. And that kind of understanding, while it does exist in Japan, because like obviously in almost any developed society, there will be differences between the rich and the poor. But it still, like, it's not to the same extent that it is in the United States government. There is no, not government, but society. There is no overwhelming difference between the rich and poor.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is individual cases of Japanese people who are ridiculously rich. Masayoshi Son is like the one good example. He's the I think founder and CEO of SoftBank, and he's
Yeah,
worth
he
like
better be stupid rich.
he's worth I think close to $40 billion or 50 billion. But I think we were talking about this last week. One of the reasons that these kind of like super gigantic dynasties of wealth don't exist in Japan is because there is a federally imposed estate tax. So
Yes.
when people who are really rich die, the government takes basically 50% of what they own, or maybe more. I'm not exactly sure what the tax is, but
Yes, no, that's exactly right. It can go up to about 55% of the inheritance money, which that in and of itself means a lot of the sort of money that would have been inherited goes back to the government, and that makes it, difficult to really have a dynasty or like a
Do they take
family that's
property?
really rich.
Mhm.
If it's just the capital itself, there actually might be ways around that.
Yeah.
Because I would think
Yeah.
that what they could just do is purchase property with equivalent value and then pass the deed on to their descendants before they pass away.
Yeah, I mean, I also talked about this last week. Is that like if you really want to keep it, there's probably a way to get around it. There always
Yeah.
is. Like there's always kind of tax loopholes. I mean, but I still I can't imagine that like somebody who's as wealthy as, for example, the CEO of SoftBank would like get away with paying, I don't know, like $2 billion in estate tax. Like he would have to pay a pretty
Yeah.
hefty sum, I imagine.
There's kind of I don't know if this is true, but like culturally speaking, like there is this kind of idea that like the state is something you should respect and acknowledge. And to kind of circumvent the system by like making an offshore bank account or like doing all these sort of subtle things to get out of having to pay that. It doesn't feel like a competition. It just feels like criminality. If they, in that sense,
Ah, yes, the opposite, understandable.
so it's kind of not really encouraged. I mean, sure, there's incentive to do it. So I can imagine there are definitely ways around this, but you know, it's not to the same extent I would argue as it is in American study. And
I would agree with that, certainly.
if
There's
anyone's
like, my bad, I didn't mean to cut you off.
if anyone's thinks I'm wrong about that, please correct me, and we will be happy to amend that in a future podcast episode. You know what I mean?
I'm definitely agreeing with you on that. I find there's a lot of stuff in Japan that relies on the expectation that people will be at the very least okay or follow a set expectation, which makes sense given the culture and the language. There's a lot of things where you just have to know what to do when you do it and no one questions it.
Yeah.
Like the expectation that you won't lie. So in the case of a convenience store, if you're going to buy anything that requires you to be over the age of 20, so cigarettes,
Oh yeah. Oh my god.
e-cigarettes, alcohol, they have this little screen. And that's how they display how much you owe. It's how they check to see if your card's going through and ask you all the other stuff. So show you your receipt, whatever. Well, if you're purchasing anything that requires you to be over the age of 20 or 20 or older rather, it asks you, are you over the age of 20?
Yeah,
and all you have to do is click yes. They don't check, they don't ID you. Like other places directly ID you, obviously, like actual establishments, so bars, clubs, larger stores, but convenience stores at the very least, it just is on the screen. If you hit yes, you're not questioned. Yeah. And it's the expectation is that you're not going to lie, which I think is very interesting because in America that just would not fly. Yeah, that's just not. That's just asking to get audited. Like,
there are a lot of things that would not fly in America. And this is a good point of comparison. We can our next sort of topic is dive into the differences between American work life and Japanese work life, and that's something that we can definitely think about. But before we transition into that in terms of work life, just the thing that you mentioned, Bryce, that would not fly is I don't know how common this is in U.S. stores. I don't think it's very common. I haven't seen it. But it's not uncommon in Japanese stores for the product that is being sold to literally just be outside the store with no one watching it.
Wait.
Right there. The expectation is that the person who is purchasing will pick up the item and on their own trust completely walk inside the store to purchase it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I know what you're
I've
referring
seen,
to.
I've seen those when I
Yeah.
was walking around Hada
It-
JP. There were some like mannequins with like these really nice outfits on. You're just expected to grab them, walk in the store, and pay for them, and then leave.
And like in the United States, I'm pretty sure that at least in many parts of it, if that happened, people would just find that as an
Shoplift, yeah.
excuse to pluck
No,
things.
You know what I think is really impressive? When I was over there in Japan, I was there for 2 weeks the first time I went there, and I always kept forgetting my umbrella and like in places, because like I don't know, it was like an umbrella that I bought, and it was a really nice umbrella, but it was really like inexpensive. So I don't know, I feel like it just kind of left my mind at times. Like it literally cost me, I think, $4. Yeah, like 400 yen. That's what an umbrella costs in Japan. It was really nice.
You can get them for cheaper too if you wanted to.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
But anyway, I remember like the second umbrella I bought after I left my first one on the train. I went to a convenience store and they have these like racks for you to put your umbrella in before you go in because they don't want it to like
Yeah.
the
that's what I
water
was saying.
that's like stuck on the umbrella. They don't want it to get on the floor. So I just put it there. I went in and we were in there for a while because we were deciding what to get. And then once we walked out, we were so hungry, we just like left and like I forgot my umbrella there. And I didn't notice until like 6 days later when it was about to rain. And I was like, wait, where's my umbrella?
my
And I was
God.
like, let me go back to the convenience store. Like, and it was there, like still in the
Yeah.
rack. And I was like,
Yeah.
holy crap. Like 6 days I left an umbrella there and nobody took
Nobody
it.
grabbed it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of lucky though, because I've seen some people have their umbrella stolen.
That's
That
so
was like, that was different because that was probably because they had a convenience store umbrella and
Mm-hmm.
all of the people who were drinking had convenience store umbrellas as well.
yeah.
So they probably just grabbed it and left thinking it was theirs. So
Yeah,
that's a bit
yeah.
different.
Mhm.
But I think that I still think that's kind of a stroke of luck, no matter how you look at it.
Yeah.
People just
No,
don't
I mean,
order people's umbrellas too. Like
mhm.
that's just not a thing people in Japan do, unless you're in high school where it happens in anime all the time.
Yeah. No, but it was really, I guess I was kind of touched that nobody took my umbrella.
So yeah, we can dive right into American work life versus Japanese work life. Can somebody who isn't me discuss briefly what the American work life is like and the sort of complexities that can come with it, like the average stereotype, not like every industry, because that could take forever.
Well, as the resident business major, I'm obligated to, unfortunately. So it varies heavily according to industry, but I would say I shouldn't start off with a comparison, but I can make a couple already. So American work culture is a lot like it's very deeply rooted in the basic expectations of standard American culture anyway. That's to say you are expected to have some form of respect for your superiors, and there is a degree of familiarity that comes with just being in the same workplace. And like there's a bit more emphasis, again, hugely dependent on industry and even more dependent on company. But the idea of yes, you're working for a company, but you are still a person, and that comes with certain rights and obligations, and of course expectations. So something that a lot of companies that, at least a lot of companies that are trying to attract a younger demographic to enter their industry, focus on work-life balance, which I feel like is something that's not like directly addressed in Japan, but in America, and at least in from what I've seen of a lot of companies, they acknowledge what you get at like for yourself individually because they don't want to burn you out, so to speak. They're going to work you to the bone if they can, depending on company, of course. But there's this expectation that if you don't have a good balance and respect for the people working for you, you're going to lose them. And the reasoning for that is, well, Americans want things for themselves slightly more than they want to like be a part of something greater than themselves on average.
Mm-hmm.
So if they feel that a company's not treating them a particular way, or they're not getting something out of what they're doing, they're just going to leave. So companies have to find ways to retain their workforce, but also to push their workforce to generate as much profit as possible.
Yeah. No, and like just before you talked about the efforts to retain workers, you mentioned something which I think is kind of the core difference between Japanese and American work life is the sort of philosophy behind it. In Japan, I tend to think that it's more of kind of a collectivist ideology. Like you're more like part of the big group, like do your job and like the machine will work. And then in America, you're the individual, and sure, you're still part of the company, but more than anything, you're yourself. So like don't let yourself be kind of abused by this like mega corporation, right? And so
I think a nice inversion of that is like in America, a collective is made of individuals, but in Japan, an individual is part of a collective.
yeah, I mean, and like one thing that I think is related to that is the way that unions operate in the US versus in Japan. So like in the US, unions have like a super extensive history, and they actually, hold a lot of power, locally or, at the state level. And in Japan, unions exist, but they're not the same, and like they're kind of looked down upon, from what I understand. And they operate from a different standpoint than do the American companies or the American unions. So like American unions are very often kind of lobbying for like better wages, like better working conditions, etc. They're being proactive about what they want for workers in America. But from what I've read, Japanese unions are more reactive. So they respond to kind of very blatant abuses of workers in Japan. And they're like, okay, this cannot fly. We're going to, pursue legal action to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But they don't like lobby as much for, workers' benefits as do American unions. And I think that's also, because of the image that unions get in Japan. They're kind of thought of as people who are complaining about their current situation instead of getting down and doing the work.
I would agree with those statements. And so, yeah, collectivist versus individualist forms of society that really have major implications in like the little things. And yeah, we've talked about Keigo, we've talked about all of this stuff, and I think we have a pretty decent picture now of both the Japanese and the American sides. And so I think we touched upon this briefly with this idea of the sort of individual versus the collective, but in terms of like the psychology of the worker and their relationship to the companies that they work for and their coworkers, it's important to think about how like the average Japanese worker probably has a very kind of relational understanding of their situation. These are the people that I can talk to like this. These are the people I can talk to like so.
Yeah.
If I want to have this conversation, I have to have it with these kinds of people. And even outside of the direct workplace relations, on an individual level, you have an understanding that this person is a gossip. They talk all the time. I shouldn't tell anything, sketchy to them. This person is a trusted senior of mine. I can come to him for help. There's all that kind of understanding, and to an extent that exists in American companies, but it's also much more of a. I would say that like the emphasis is less on those relations.
I would say somewhat, because that's definitely still something you see in American culture, obviously, or in American workplaces, obviously. But there's like a baseline expectation for professionalism, whatever that generally means, can be translated to the usage of Keigo, I suppose. Um, because of the way English works as a language, it's not necessarily the way you conjugate or say things, it's the specific words that you use,
Mhm.
and like the volume of words that you're using, because English is a vocab dependent language rather than a verb dependent language. Um, so it still has that like that need to be cognizant of where you are placed relative to another person. But I think the primary difference is if you're really close to a superior of yours, you can get away with speaking to them in the equivalent of casual.
Yeah.
Am I getting surveillance tested again? Are you serious?
Yeah.
Just last week. Anyway,
Yeah.
yeah. So you can get away with like, 'cause it like the social strata that you're on. While it's there for like general identification purposes, I would say that it's superseded by your direct relationship with the person with whom you were conversing,
Yeah.
as opposed to in Japanese. If you refer to your superior in a public context in anything less than the respect that they deserve, you are going to definitely be looked down upon or otherwise scrutinized for that behavior, and it will be considered unacceptable, even though it's you and that person have a good relationship. It's just the way the language works and the expectation that you will uphold that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true.
All right. So I think one thing that would be worth talking about is kind of taking a look at how the business culture in Japan has affected both, Japan's economic prosperity and also the life of its citizens.
Yeah.
Um, obviously, we we mentioned briefly how these people who are working kind of the stereotypical white collar job and doing overtime are often working 18 to 20 hours a day, and that's obviously not healthy. So there's pros and cons to it. What do you guys think are some of the more obvious pros and cons that we can talk about?
Well, I mean, for one thing, it's like the companies work as a group, as a collective, and as such, it's a lot more efficient in a way.
Hmm.
Like there's a lot
Mhm.
more that can get done, and because of this attitude of trying to make sure that you're, always working hard and always being vigilant in order to have this good social image, there's a lot less of an attitude of, oh, let's see how much I can get away with not having to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I think with the American workplace, you still have that emphasis on efficiency. At least at higher and more respected companies that are like towards the top of their bracket. Um, but I would definitely say that because the structure itself is less concerned with maintaining a certain status quo and meeting that caricature of a business person,
Mhm.
there's a lot more variation in how that work gets done and precisely how much of it an individual is responsible for.
That's true. And in terms of like other pros that could exist, uh, I'd say another pro would probably be, let's see what we have here. I mean, it like on a global scale, like it's not just efficiency, but like it shows how like there was that entire point in the 60s and 70s, Japan was just booming as an economic power.
Hmm.
And part of that was it leads there's this attitude of constant forward progression where like at least as a whole, Japan has always been a country that's focused on if somebody can do something better than we can, we're going to figure out why they can do it better, and we're going to take that and we're going to improve that.
Hmm.
Mm,
And
Yeah.
that was how sort of the major restoration happened. That was sort of how rapid industrialization happened. And I'd say that kind of thing is only really possible when everybody feels a form of unity where they say, all right, as a group, we are going to overcome this, as opposed to, each individual person kind of working as an individual cell in a company.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Um, I'd still like to chime in on that because it's good to generalize that, yeah, working together helps with progress, but there you can also bring up the fact that, a lot of people bring up how Japanese businesses are, technologically advanced, but also stuck in the 80s at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of things that, like you said, preserving a status quo. They keep a lot of these traditions like going from the past that probably have can probably be done better. Like I could bring up how they use fax machines still, right?
Yeah.
Like fax machines
Yeah.
are like a really big part of Japanese businesses. Probably the bureaucracy itself, how slow it moves because of all the
Yeah.
paperwork and the formalities can be a hindrance as well. Like I know
Yeah.
how it
Yeah.
solidifies these procedures, but trying to get approval for using a logo or something can probably take a week for someone to just look over and say, okay.
Yeah. No,
Um,
and
yeah,
now that you mentioned that, interestingly, I heard last week in one of my Japanese classes that Japan is finally getting rid of hanko, the stamps to sign
Wait,
documents.
really?
Yeah,
Hanko's getting rid of?
Yeah.
Oh my God! Finally, I can be a foreigner in Japan.
Yeah, no, so
I know,
I'm
right?
kidding. I'm not trying to move there, but bro,
yeah,
Like-
no, so
like-
Get mine soon.
the prime minister, the new prime minister, he said, yeah, get ready because we're getting rid of that.
he said, "Yeah, Hanko, get rid of that shit." Oh my God, that's
Yeah.
so good. Okay, so for context, for those who don't know, Hanko is a personalized stamp, usually with the characters for your name. I believe it was always your last name, but I think you had a different one for your full name.
Mhm.
You'd usually have multiple, and you would use this to sign papers. So if you wanted to get a new license, or you wanted registration for a family member, or anything that had to be done formally and officially, you have to bring your hanko to that location and stamp every single spot on that paper
Mhm.
perfectly. That's a separate problem. You have to stamp it, right? And if you didn't have it, you couldn't sign it. They wouldn't
Mhm.
accept a signature. You have to use a hanko, and you
Yeah.
have to get it personally made with the correct character for your legal name. And getting rid of that is huge.
Yeah.
Because it makes the process of moving paperwork a lot easier, because it's
Mhm.
not just certain things, it's everything.
Yeah, no, it's like my mom. I know for a fact our family has one, but I've only seen it used for really important documents because my mom has it. But yeah, no, it's pretty important. Even though they sell it's weird because you want the ones that collaborate with your family's sort of name, but they also just sell a bunch of them in 7-Elevens and stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's if you have an uncommon name, you kind of need to go a bit out of your way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So foreigners in particular have a problem with it, because you need to go through a lot of paperwork, one, to be registered as a citizen, not as a citizen, but as a resident. And because most foreigners don't have Japanese last names, or names that can just, be converted, unless they're Chinese and have a Chinese last name that happens to also carry over, you're in for a rough time.
Mhm. Yeah, no. But I think that, definitely if you take a look at the Japanese economy as proportional to, its population, it's definitely still a very impressive one. And, people forget that just, less than or probably a decade and a half ago, it was still, competing with China to be, the second largest economy in the world. And to me, Japan is particularly impressive because it has around the same population as Mexico, and Mexico is nothing compared to Japan economically. It's 5 times smaller, and in terms of what it produces, it's way more impressive in my opinion. Mexico has its sort of really really impressive spots, spread out, over the course of the entire country. But Japan as a whole is I think really something that other countries should learn from in terms of what they've been able to achieve with their limited natural resources, their limited population, their etc. So yeah.
Yeah, no, like there's certainly quite a few of the positives that can come with this, and I think we've brought up pretty much all of the major ones. But then what Jerry was saying earlier about how there's a lot of things that come as a consequence to some of the structures of Japanese society's work life, and I think a big one is this idea of sort of family unit and how that is compromised by just the way that Japanese society tends to work. It's difficult to find time to really build a family
Right.
and spend time with them when you're working 12 to 18 hours a day on just your daily company grind. Like it's not even for stuff that would be considered particularly important. It's like every day you're expected to just kind of put in these huge hours.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I think that Japanese work life is definitely a factor with regards to what has happened to the Japanese family unit and, their problem with a declining population and, decreasing, marriage rates among young people, et cetera. But I think that, there's also, I think there's several things that factor into that problem. I don't think it's as simple as because people are working more, they're not getting married as much or they're not having kids as much. But I think that the business culture has also led to some interesting, perhaps positive outcomes. If you consider the way that Japanese families have had to adapt to a situation where both the mother and the father of a family are not always present. You think of Japanese kids and how they commute by themselves, since they're like 6 years old, which I think is mind-boggling. I watched a documentary on it where they compared it to like the way that American culture treats kids who are independent, and the same thing in Australia, and it basically happens nowhere else in the world, because Japan also is a country with a very low crime rate. This has been able to be done, right? Kids are able to go by themselves to school, and that's not a huge concern for parents who would otherwise have to commute with their kids to school. So I think there's both positives and negatives to the way that business culture has affected family life. And I think the example of kids commuting is one of the positives. I think that independence at a young age definitely goes a long way in shaping a person's character. I wouldn't know, but I would like to think that it does. I think that it would be very cool to have a kid who at 6 years old could like grab 4 trains and get to their school, like
in one piece.
Yeah, no, I think that would be pretty impressive.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of that happening. And so you mentioned earlier, like it's difficult to attribute fully the sort of lack of familial growth in Japan to the work-life balance. And I agree with that sentiment. There's a lot of other things that contribute to that, but it's undeniable some of the systematic ways in which companies in a way discourage a sort of commitment to the
Right.
family. One of them being maternity leave.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if this has changed in the past 2 decades because I haven't been in Japan all that often, but at least when my mom and my dad were working in the same company, when my mom was pregnant with me, the company flat out told her, we don't do maternity leave, so one of you gets to stay.
One of you gets to stay.
And so
Oh
that's
my
the
god.
story of how my
Dang.
mom quit her job. So
Yeah.
Oh lord.
Yeah, that's not very friendly, is it?
That hit different. They just straight said it.
Yeah.
like that's not what they literally said, but you get my point. Is that like
Yeah, they said
Yeah,
it in Keigo, right?
They said it in Keigo. 申し訳ありません。すいませんでしたが、
exactly,
あの
exactly.
ね。
So, like, that didn't stop my parents, but at the same time, it probably stops a lot of people from being like, okay, well, I'm like, if you're a working woman, you're like, I don't want children because if I have children, I can't work my job.
You can't
Right.
provide for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting problem, and I'm looking forward to see how either the Japanese government or just the Japanese people and their culture are going to try to solve it, because I think right now most predictions put the Japanese population by 2100 at less than 60 million, so about half of what it is right now. So it's a pretty serious problem, and I think that if a big change isn't made soon, there's going to be some pretty bad consequences to it. So
Agreed. There's definitely going to be some serious repercussions if we let the birth rate continue to decline as it does, because honestly, I don't know. I don't know what the future will look like, but the work-life culture in Japan has been in place for the past like several decades now. And I think that we're starting to see some of the weaknesses in the system.
Yeah, and one thing that I think we should talk about just for context, in after World War II, Japan entered this, tremendous period of economic growth. But then around the 1990s, it started stagnating, and it's been kind of stagnant, ever since, pretty much. And one of the reasons for that is because of what happened to interest rates in Japan. And they're actually negative, slightly. So you lose money by putting it in the bank. But it's it's an interesting problem that economists still struggle with. They call it a liquidity trap. But yeah, that's also another problem that Japan has to deal with. And Japan isn't, like, you talk about how it's been stagnant for a couple of decades now, but it's not struggling economically as many people think it is. I think when people hear about Japan's kind of stagnant economy, they imagine like it's in decline. But that's absolutely not the case. And anybody who's traveled to Japan can tell you that. It's still a very prosperous country by any standard. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. Like, stagnation just means like there wasn't the same massive growth that there was in the sort of mid 20th century, but Japan's doing pretty all right, I'd say.
Yeah,
I've been there. Everyone's still happy. Everyone's still working. Still plenty of tourism, although probably less in the recent couple of years. But
yeah,
that's the same everywhere. But one more thing, I think we're getting close to time here. But one more topic I like to bring up, because this is kind of important, is the sort of psychological stress that can be placed on the average Japanese worker as a result of their rigorous schedule. Because trust me, when we say Japanese people, we work these crazy hours, but that doesn't mean that they're robots or anything, or that they don't feel stressed out or tired. And trust me, when you're working so many hours a week, it can get on you. It can wear you down. And there's a lot of Japanese culture which is just having either addressing or responding to the stress that can be caused in the.
And you said it can wear you down. It can hurt your mental state, but it can actually kill you. There's
it can actually kill you.
There's it happens in Japan. It's actually a problem. People dying from overwork, and it's so common. I think there's about 90 cases of death from overwork every year in Japan, and they have a term for it. It's called karoshi, or overwork
karoshi.
death. Yeah.
Karoshi.
On the note of what I was covering in that surveying class, we talked about karoshi a lot as well. When we were covering that, we were covering like hikikomori, karoshi, zangyo suru, all that stuff. Zangyo being the overtime thing that Ernesto mentioned before. That's the Japanese word for it.
Yeah. No, there's definitely so much of that. And like Ernesto was saying, or Ernesto and Bryce were just discussing, suicide rates in Japan they're not insignificant. Although I will point out, like, it's not just a problem with Japan. Like, China has a similar problem. Korea has a similar problem. It's just that when you are part of this collectivist culture, you as an individual may feel it difficult to kind of be appreciated or feel like there are people in your life that can sort of acknowledge you as an individual and sort of give you the sort of love and care that you might want, you know.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think Bryce mentioned it briefly. Is hikikomori are another set of people who are often the result of poor outcomes in either the workplace or their educational lives. I remember watching a documentary which talked about how most hikikomori become hikikomori, and hikikomori is a term which basically means hermit, but it refers to people who refuse to leave their house and interact with people in the outside world. They kind of, retreat into their shell and live in their houses their entire, lives. And one of the reasons for that is because, many of these people have had really poor experiences, either, while they were in college or when they were entering the workplace, and they felt like their failure was so tremendous that they could never again interact, with the outside world in the same way.
Yeah.
And so I think that business culture also plays a part in that social problem. But I
People,
think it's less direct than.
yeah, people just say, look at this sort of grind that you have to look forward to for the rest of your working life, because a lot of like Japanese companies and Japanese work life in general, it is, we should have mentioned this earlier, a lot of it is you work at the same company your entire life.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a whole lot of mobility in terms of like, oh, I guess I'll quit my job and move here, or quit my job and move here, like there is in the US, where you can just kind of find a better place in a different company. That's a less common in Japan, and it's sort of similar to the game of chicken of like not leaving your workplace, where like you almost seem to be hinting at something if you quit your job and move to a different company, and you don't want to deal with that because people will ask questions.
Yeah.
And in Japan, that kind of thing matters a lot. So
Yeah. No, and like you said, right now it's actually looked down upon if you kind of work for very short stints at particular companies, even if you left, because you wanted to leave. Companies will look at that and say like, that's kind of sketchy. Like you only worked there for 2 years. Like what a lightweight.
What a lightweight, bro.
Yeah.
Get the numbers up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the other thing that ties into that is another thing that is deeply rooted in the language and the culture. So in Japanese, there's this, we cover it a lot because it's very important to know how to do it, and it's very annoying to do. The idea of giving and receiving favors and whatnot. So I'm not going to explain all of it, but the basic principle of it is the words that you use, and this also applies to when you're talking to superiors and inferiors socially. The words that you use are dependent upon their proximity to you as an individual. So the way to look at this is there's an in-group and there's an out-group. And anything from the out-group going to the in-group, you're using a particular set of verbs. Anything going from the in-group to the out-group, use a different verb. And of course, the individual is the greatest in-group because there's no one closer to you than yourself. But aside from that, because there's this idea of like groupings and separation, when you're in a company, you are in that in-group. That company is your in-group. And to leave that in-group, one is terrifying, and two is not necessarily socially acceptable all the time, because you're basically taking yourself out of an in-group and forcing yourself into an out-group. And getting into another in-group is very difficult if you're not going entry level. Because because if you think about it logically, entry level, you're not supposed to be, it's the easiest point of access, right? But like, let's say you're a senior at a particular company, you trying to leave that company and going to another one and entering that in-group is going to be very challenging. So like this part of the language has like a very strong cultural basis, and the same even carries into club activities in universities and in high schools, where there's this expectation of grouping and social understanding of that. So it is very deeply rooted and carries forward even into the workplace.
Yeah, agreed. And so a lot of what people have done is there's aspects of Japanese culture that at work to either decompress, de-stress, or allow people to cope with the kind of work-life grind. And there are many different ways in which that can happen. Obviously, bars and that kind of thing are a very common sort of response to that. Like people go out, they drink, and there are sort of individual bars as well. You know, like where you have your own kind of booth and you can eat and drink at your own,
Yes.
which is
Izakayas.
not as common a thing over in the West, but
Mm.
also there's like karaoke booths and that kind of thing. People can either as a group or as an individual just kind of sing and unwind, have a drink, maybe eat dinner there while you're there. And a lot of the human interaction that you might, because Keigo can get kind of tiring on the soul if you for enough. And there are a lot of like automated ticket booth things where you can buy food tickets and use and exchange those. So you don't have to go through the whole conversation if you've had a really long day and you just want to eat and you don't really want to talk to anyone.
Yeah.
There is a lot of stuff in Japan that's automated or otherwise removed from human interaction. I mentioned izakayas earlier, which are basically just traditional Japanese bars, and they oftentimes have food and in addition to drinks. And something I noticed with a decent amount of izakayas is that they'll have like Yuki said, one-off booths that you can kind of just sit at and order your stuff from. And this one location that my friends and I went to, there was you didn't have to you had the option of calling someone if there was like a serious question that you had or you like just wanted to get the tab, whatever. But instead of ordering for them, you just like grab a tablet and order what you want. It's brought to you. No conversation with the other person whatsoever would be necessary. And like that, it's not like that's the first time that I saw that. You see it in sushi bars, you see it in yakiniku locations, you see it in plenty of restaurants and other places people would go to unwind. So I would say, like, as technology has evolved, Japan's taken advantage of that to allow people to kind of distance themselves from from strangers, essentially.
Yeah. And so, yeah, there's a whole lot of that you might find, and there are other ways you can deal with stress. Gotcha games, for instance, is a big one.
Yes. Gotcha game episode pending arrival.
We're slowly working our way towards that. Slowly but surely.
That's gonna be such a wonderful nightmare. I'm so excited.
Yeah. Well, I think that Japanese work life is a complicated topic that we could talk for hours and hours about. But I think we've given a pretty decent overview of what it consists of. We compared it to American work life, and then we also talked a little bit about how it affects the average Japanese person, the family unit, and the adaptations that Japanese society has come up with to accommodate for these kinds of conditions. But if do you guys think there's one last point that we should make to kind of finish this up?
Yeah, is there anything that we can talk about? Like, there's obviously depression and sort of anxiety disorders that can come up as part of the average Japanese person's way, sort of like response to the work life. Some people thrive in this culture, and
That's true.
feel the order and the sort of rigidity of it actually is something that they can rely on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think that goes, for people everywhere in the world. We all have that one friend who, always complains about work, but that, they love doing work. It's kind of weird. But, like, no, like I have a friend, she's back in Mexico, but she's always, talking about how she's like overworked and overstressed, but then she's also applying for like administrative positions and different
Literally,
things.
oh my god.
So,
it's so painful.
it's I think that regardless of how harsh Japanese work culture is, I think it keeps going because some people do function, well, not some people, a lot of people do function effectively within it. So yeah.
Yes, and so it's not all bad, everybody. Like, there's good and bad. For some people, it's really painful and stressful. For other people, it's kind of pleasant, and the work that they grind gives you something to do. Anyone else have any closing thoughts on that?
No,
All righty.
I've said my piece.
Well, with that said, then I think it's good if we call it for this particular episode.
Thank you for watching.
Yes.
And we look forward to more conversations. Feel free to suggest topics in the Google form that we send out on our weekly email. We'd love to talk about things that you guys are interested in.
So yeah, thank you very much, and we will see you all next week.